My name is Brett Carlson, and I did this tin piece here. And been working in the world of art for about 12 years now. Although I wanted to really get serious about it for a long time. But I also have a full-time job, so this is just kind of a passion for me, and it allows me to do whatever I want to do without having to be fixated on trying to sell something. So I think that gives you some additional freedoms. So the story behind this, I wanted to just kind of illustrate, because I had to look back at my whole life, and there's like 3 or 4 main things that happened to me that got to this point. And the first one was, I grew up in this area down in Lakewood, and when I was 17 years old, a senior in high school, I quit towards springtime. And I had to convince my parents, the principal, the counselor, and the teachers, which all went into an uproar, that it would be okay for me to quit school, go to Europe for 6 months at the age of 17 by myself, and come back and go back to school and finish. So I finally got a chance to do that, and I took off for 6 months. Back then it was pretty cheap. It cost me $500 for 6 months of traveling through Europe. But one of the things I did when I was there was I went on a train over through East Germany to Berlin. And when I got to Berlin, checked into a youth hostel and went down to see Checkpoint Charlie, which is kind of the portal into East Berlin. And so at 17, by myself, walked into East Berlin on a gray, drab, wet, cold day. And that's exactly what East Berlin was about. It was just pretty depressing. Went into a couple of grocery stores that were empty. Turned around and came back to Checkpoint Charlie, and it was almost like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, you know, like leaving this black and white world into a world of color, which was pretty significant for me. So yeah, I ended up going back to school, went off to college, and the next thing that happened to me, which ties into this, believe it or not, is I went to school in Guadalajara, Mexico for 6 months. And walking from Guadalajara over to Tlaquepaque, which was kind of the art center, about a 5-mile walk, along the roadway I found this little leather baby shoe. And it probably had been run over probably 5,000 times by trucks. And it looked three-dimensional, so it's just completely flattened out. And I have always kept that since back then. For some reason, I don't know why. Okay, then you jump a couple, 10, 15 years down the road, and the next thing that happened was I was living in Hong Kong for 10 years. And where I lived out on this island about 6 miles away from the city center, they were doing some construction. And there were these tin cans that were scrunched up. They were like 5-gallon tin cans that used to have oil in them for the trucks. And they were run over and flattened out and rusted because it was right by the ocean. And I was just kind of intrigued by them. So I took them back, cleaned them up, and mounted them on a wall. And everybody I knew was just fascinated by these because it was all rust and they were flattened out, and yet they looked three-dimensional, kind of like that shoe back in Mexico. So then you jump another 10 years down the road, and I run into an artist over in Idaho that was working with metal. And I thought, wow, I've always wanted to do some serious type art, you know, serious in my head. And I looked at it and I thought, you know, this is kind of interesting. He lived in LA next to a tin factory. Well, we don't have tin factories up here. So looking for kind of the avenue, Goodwill, decorative tins, like tins that have Christmas cookies in it with Santa on the cover. So with, you know, Coca-Cola cans or whatever, you know, these iconic symbols. So I tried, my very first piece I tried was I cut out a little bit of metal about this big, nailed it onto a piece of plywood. Literally a triangle of 3 inches by 1.5 inches. And it was like, oh, guess what? This works. And that was the beginning of it, like 12 years ago. Okay, so getting into the concept here is, now I've been to 76 countries around the world, and across a lot of borders. You see a lot of cultures. And so what I was trying to illustrate here was, for us Americans, we always look at ourselves as being like the #1 country in the world. But yet, there's millions of people that want to come in as immigrants into the United States. But one of the problems is we never look at it from the other side. So this kind of represents mentally the challenges that an immigrant has to face. Kind of chaos and obstacles to get to the, let's say, the wall or the border of the United States. And I'd say the black kind of represents the wall. And the promised land is above that. Kind of like Eastern Washington or Eastern Oregon or something like that, all the fields and the abundance of good weather and stuff like that. So that was kind of the concept of this whole thing. I wanted to do it big. This piece has probably 150 different tins in it that have been cut up. The process is kind of like stained glass. You use a template to make a piece that you want, and then you find on the tin with the piece of transparency template the shape that you want, where you want it, and then cut it out. This has 7,000 nails in it. So part of the concept here is to make it look contemporary. There's no frames or anything. And the nails give it a consistency. So even though it's hard to sometimes get enough green, for example, or enough rain, or flags that look like sky or whatever, sometimes you run out of this stuff. Maybe this color you only have a little bit in a tin. So your palette is quite limited. But the consistency of the nails kind of pull it together. And so that's Immigración. So it's Spanish. So you kind of are tempted to look at it from the outside, looking into getting into America and our cultures. Questions?
How do you get the work so flat? Is it the nails mainly?
Each piece, okay, each piece is kind of interesting. Not interesting, it's labor intensive. Each piece you cut out, make a template, you cut it out, rough, and so it's got a serrated edge, and then you take a tin snip that has a smooth cut, and you cut it out, nail it down, flatten it out, turn it over, flatten it out, and then kind of reposition it, maybe recut it a little, and then nail it down. So there's a lot of nails that help flatten it out. But there's a lot of hammering too.
Yeah, I don't see the hammer marks. So
No, they don't. It doesn't seem to damage the paint that has been baked onto the tin. Yeah. And then wrap it around the corners as well. I would say probably this took at least 200 hours to do. At least. Maybe more. Yeah.
I like the way you wrap it around the corners too, so the finish.
Yeah, you kind of get that contemporary style. Yeah.
where do you get the purple?
The purple.
You have a lot of purple and blues.
Okay. Okay. If you look closely, here's a tin that actually is ice.
Oh.
So it was like a glacial type tin that had polar bears and foxes on it and stuff, and it was ice. Here you have actually some polar bears drinking Coca-Cola, right? And then you have these little images of paintings, famous paintings from around the world that are on like Fleischmann's, the cookie or the chocolates. Tins like that. And so you just take advantage of those kind of things. And sometimes you just have to kind of create them too. But one of the ones that I was really tempted that I'd like to do this size is a really rough type image of more like looking like the ocean here, and then have an orca kind of diffuse swimming through it, you know. But then when you have so much time to make these and you spend so much time on them, lots of ideas pop up all the time. One of the things that come out of my little portfolio here is as you look through all of them, there's hardly any consistency in the sense of a theme, because you are limited by what you can find using recycled metal. And sometimes you just run out. And so you have to take those concepts and work them. And so I have many different images that are just totally different from one another. Thank you. Thank you.